Welcome to our new segment.
PI nyo!
Oh my gosh. Of course, galit ka ba? Bakit? PI nyo. What does PI mean? That's not what you think. It means personal inquiries or podcast inquiries where we take your questions. Of course, we would normally do it in regular episodes, so we want to have a segment where we take our time with them. And Borge, what is our question for this episode in our maiden voyage?
Yeah, this was again we have had so many questions before, but for the maiden voyage of PI nyo. So it's from Mr. Sean Mans. Well, that's a signature, but well, he said that he enjoyed the podcast, but I'll just run through the congratulations and expressions of gratitude. And but then again, his question would be, okay, quoting him, from my experience, there are many laws in the Philippines. More are being written every day, it seems, and most of them are not followed. Also, it seems that there are very few people enforcing said laws. I see police, but I'm not sure if I've ever seen them give out a ticket. Hindi ka pa titikitan, kuya. Yun lang sagot yan. Also, also, the idea of the tanod seems fine, but I'm not sure if the execution of the tanod leads to Filipinos following more laws. So, also in regards to judges and the judicial branch, it just seems that there are many openings for judges. I've heard some guy said that there were 1,000 plus current vacancies for judges throughout the country. I actually made a paper. I wrote a brief paper with my good friends here back in undergrad regarding the problems in our judicial branch. Especially the problematic branch would be the appellate courts. So Court of Appeals is always problematic. And then you have very local politicians breaking various contracts, etc. Okay. So he wants to understand the issue of laws and lawlessness in the Philippines. So from a historical perspective. Okay.
Historical. Well, what we have to say is that thank you for your email and thank you for listening to the podcast. But we have to say that we're not scholars of the law, nor are we lawyers, nor are we even sociologists of the law. But we do find it as an interesting question. And at least, especially when you talk about, of course, the TANODs and its enforcement and of course and its creation, there's a lot there. Number one, I think you and I both agree with this, is that there are thousands, if not, almost tens of thousands of laws passed and written every so often, every year. It's difficult to keep track. There's a new law for every little thing, like a new slight increase in tax, a slight decrease in tax, a new holiday, a new coliseum, a new monument,
street name,
the name of a street names, exactly. So you're right in saying there's a saturation point of our laws, so it's difficult to memorize them all. And so not all laws are equal. There's a law for every little thing and every big thing, like by Dihan 1, 2, and 3. And at the same time, their enforcement is also done by laws. To our mind.
Yeah. You need implementing laws for certain laws.
Oh yeah, there is another document with the implementing rules and regulations. So it's a complicated thing, but I think what we should focus on, without going too much into technicalities, is the relationship between people and laws. Would you like to start on that? Like, what do you think is the primary relationship between a regular citizen, a regular person, and the law? Like, at least a Filipino. Like, how does a Filipino?
Anong pananaw ng mga ordinaryong Pilipino sa batas? I think this can be captured by our usual quotation or a dictum amongst Filipinos na marami ng batas ang problema, yung pagpapatupad. So I think that basically sums up how ordinary citizens approach legal matters. So for them, it's not a matter of the number of laws per se, as more or less expressed in your own email. But I think it's about the agency behind laws. So its implementation would be there. We can talk about laws as institutions, but what concerns ordinary citizens would be the agents behind institutions. That's why criticisms in the Philippines or critical discourse is not usually directed at institutions. They're usually directed at specific agents. So ordinary Filipinos don't have problems with government institutions. They just have problems with government people. And this is a recent realization that Philippine scholars on political science have been pondering on. Well, for them, for me, I've been advocating for agency perspective for a long time. But now we're steering towards examining agency behind institutions. Well, what about you? What do you think is the relationship of a ordinary citizen with the law?
Well, like what you said, the relationship with the law is not really with the paper or the actual word of the law, but really who implements them, and mostly
Mm.
who is the human face of the law. You know, like sino ba yung tao na kaharap mo? Di ba?
Mm.
Yung mga tanod at mga police.
Mm.
And a lot of the times, especially when they're, well, if they're ticketed or being reprimanded, minsan, parang what's the word? Parang binabola pa nila si si
Mm.
tanod o si manong police. Sige na po sir, pabigyan mo na.
Mm.
And that's a lot of the times because they think they're being merciful, they let them off,
Mm.
or they provide like a shortcut, or even sige kahit 500 na lang, like even facilitate bribery, etc.
Mm.
But as a result, they think the law is flexible as the person implementing it, which in a
Mm.
sense is true. But the sad part is it creates precedent for law being easily broken.
Mm.
Even the small laws, like driving without a license, to stealing millions of dollars, pesos from
Mm.
the from our budget, our tax-paying money. I think I do want to emphasize, I think, on the level of how you say identification with the law through. I think I've been discussing this with some students of mine, and this is called compliance, identification, and internalization. And this is
Mm.
usually how certain individuals or agents comply with the level of compliance with a certain behavior or a certain idea or norm. And the weird thing is that compliance is the most shallow. And I think this is where the Filipinos are at. Basically, they follow the law if they wish for a positive outcome. Like they follow the law if they follow the procedures if they want, say, for example, to get an ID or to get to point A to point B. Simple. They just follow the streets and properly para hindi mabangga, diba? So yeah. But two and three is a bit different. It's identification, wherein they occur when an individual accepts influence because he wants to establish and maintaining a satisfying self-defining relationship with another person or with a group. In other words, if they want to if you go into another culture, you want to be amiable, you start learning their language, you start to do what they do, but mostly just to please the other person or to maintain polite relations. So, but you're like, for example, you and I started learning Chinese, so we be able to communicate, but not as you don't really identify and believe you are Chinese, something like that. And the deepest one, which I think what we're all hoping for with regards to laws, is internalization, which can occur when an individual accepts influence because the content is induced of the induced behavior are intrinsically rewarding. In other words, they believe that the law is good, and they believe in the law 100% deep down in their hearts. And while we all wish that were to happen, we believe in the law. The law is good and the law is just, and we need to follow the laws for a peaceful society. Quite frankly, we see other people disobeying it, so we forget the long-term idea of the law and say, sumisingit naman yung tao, sige, sisingit din ako. So that's the problem. Why would you follow the law when it's actually more advantageous to break the law? Same thing with road regulations. If you're a driver, or simple things like if you're in line in city hall or barangay hall, like sisingit ka na lang, di ba? Kung mas madali, so may kilala ka sa barangay hall, lumapit ka sa kanya. So yeah, what do you think? You have anything to add with that?
That is, well, that's a Western perspective on it. It's one thing that's for sure. Do we have a long-term vision or long-term ideal regarding laws in the Philippines? I think we do. It's just not, it doesn't fit the Western model. We're in laws. It doesn't fit the Western model of rule of law. This is something that we should realize right now, that I think Filipinos, we don't have data on this, sadly, because many survey data really don't measure the relationship of ordinary citizens with the law. What they measure is the relationship between government actors with the law. So this can be a subject for future analysis, but just for pondering on it, I think we have an idea of ruling through law. Through law. So there must be an intrinsic combination between political action from the implementers of the law, from the makers of the law, with the law themselves. So it's not rule of laws, absolute, so on and so forth. I don't think that will fit us in the Philippines, first and foremost. It's not because we are corrupt. It's not because, but again, we have certain cultural values that emphasizes interpersonal relations rather than solid laws or legislation.
Mhm.
We have our own norms, first and foremost. We
Mhm.
have our own norms.
Mm.
Uh, but yeah, I think we have an idea of rule through law, and China, as a relatively successful country, have
Oh.
integrated this notion of rule through law in their own system. So they
Okay.
don't.
Let me just raise a point there, just for our readers who are not familiar. Like the standard attitude of this is rule of law. In fact, that's a tenet of good governance, where of course it's
Western.
follow the law as such, etc. So, can you explain the difference between rule of law and rule through law?
Okay, rule of law more or less gives primacy to the law itself. You know, the law is
Mhm.
something absolute. Rule
Mhm.
through law emphasizes the relationship between political actors and the law,
Mhm.
the relationships among political actors and the law. The law, to an
Mhm.
extent, is a bit more flexible under
Mhm.
the discourse of rule through law
Mhm.
rather than rule of law. So
Right.
that's another thing. And I think I could also entertain the angle that in line with the nature of legislation in the Philippines, as you have mentioned a while ago, this is basically a fact, we create laws for almost everything.
Mhm.
So
And it's usually
that's
to pad the CVs or the achievements of
yeah,
each lawmaker for the next
yeah,
election.
for just
Yeah.
for lawmakers to justify their existence, even if they should just
Right.
be mere researchers, as far as I'm concerned.
Hmm.
But there's also a standard, again, also a Western one, wherein laws must be broad.
Mhm.
Legislation must focus more on broad standards rather than details. Okay,
Mhm.
so you let human interaction flourish under broad
Mhm.
laws instead of trying to determine each and every part of human interaction.
Mhm.
So that's another
Yeah.
angle that one can entertain. So, what standard
Mhm.
are we judging the Philippines? If you're going to judge the Philippines from the standard of the traditional rule of law from uh, state-centric liberal perspective, then yeah, we are lawless as far as I'm concerned. We have
Mm.
so many ways to deviate from the law. But
Mhm.
if you're to analyze it from the perspective of first and foremost rule through law, then we can
Mhm.
say that it is deeply ingrained in Philippine society that we have our own ways of adjusting to laws
Mhm.
and making laws adjust to us. So, and
Yeah.
that's a recognition of a basic fact that laws are made by men.
Mhm.
Laws don't come from
Yeah.
the heavens. It comes from
Right.
legislators. It comes
Mhm.
from relationships between legislators and the represented. So
Mhm.
rule through law is just a recognition of that. Sadly, it's since it is not institutionalized, since it is marginalized, so we
Mhm.
laging under the table ang nangyayari. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
but we can also look at from the angle of broad laws. Should we have general laws instead of thoroughly detailed ones?
Mhm. Yeah.
So just to leave space, more space for interpersonal relations.
Mhm.
Uh,
S-
yeah, go ahead.
Speaking of interpersonal relations, if you look at Philippine idiom, sa well, when you say the words use the word batas, it's usually it usually alludes to a
Mm,
person, like siya ang batas. O, ako ang
mm,
batas, basta
mm,
gawin mo sinasabi ko. So even then, we still, or if it refers to like even just like the police or someone's wife, your
mm,
wife or something.
mm,
But yeah, it's still, again, the relationship of Filipinos of a lot is like anthropomorphized, or it's like
it's
it's best
realistic.
it's represented by human
Yeah,
beings. And
yeah.
in a way, because they see human beings or the representatives of the law, the politicians,
Mm,
those who enforce it as flawed, then it's just they see it more as law as just this tool of these people of power rather than an
mm,
ideal. Whereas
yeah.
that's another thing where people follow the law because following the law creates a better society of peace. That's the idea. Well, that's one ideal. That's Western, because they
Stand
believe
for
that the
you.
law is there's wisdom to the law. But because of like, well, do you think it's a bad thing, or is it just how we are? I mean, of course, clearly there's a common frustration with the reader, but this
Mm,
relationship of the law, and if it's not a bad thing, how do we make it work? Because clearly there are
mm.
there are disadvantages and problems with our relationship with the law. So how should we move forward with this?
Okay, regarding that anthropomorphize, I don't think it's anthropomorphizing, just recognizing that human beings actually lie behind laws. And that's a basic fact. That's the problem with the rule of law doctrine. You know, it veils the human aspect of laws, when in fact the human aspect is the foundation of laws.
Mm.
The human will, human intellect, human relations, those are the foundations of laws. Laws,
Mhm.
again, we should rid ourselves of this fantasy that laws come from a higher wisdom. So it comes from human interaction, and rule through law more is recognized that one. Is it a bad thing
Mhm.
or a good thing? That then we need to look at this issue from the perspective of political relations or other political relations. You know, people will only follow laws that they legitimize. Okay, they can only legitimize a certain piece of law if probably they trust the ones who proposed it, if they trust those who implement it,
Mhm.
or if they are part of the process of making it,
Mhm.
meaning it came from their own decisions. So those are ways that, to an extent, at this point, doesn't exist in the Philippines.
Mm.
For in general terms, Filipinos are excluded from lawmaking. It's alienated from them. It's basically exclusive to the Congress and to lobbyists, and not all Filipinos are more or less part of lobbying groups, and even lobbying groups contain elites. Okay. So we are too far away from our laws. We have no control over it as a citizenry. So why follow something that you have no control over? Why follow something that you did not contribute to? So why follow something that you're not really attached to? You're attached to the people implementing it. That this is where interpersonal relationships would come in. They're attached to people implementing it. And to an extent, sometimes they can be attached to people making it via lobbying. Okay? Sometimes. Okay? But
Right.
for most of the most instances, you're attached to the laws or to the implementers.
Yeah. I suppose it reminds me of our deeply Catholic roots, which of course looks at the idea of Moses as lawgiver with the tablets of the Ten Commandments. So it's like, these laws come from God, but in reality, it's most closely like he wrote it himself with a bunch of
He probably wrote in
fellow
hieroglyphs.
elders. So hieroglyphs. So that is, I think that's one thing that you and I share. Like, we need to bring lawmaking closer to the people, and of course, if they feel empowered by it, and they would agree to it, if they felt that they contributed to it, it's their law. They feel like it's theirs, and I completely agree with it. I think it's also necessary to, of course, bring this closer attention to scholars, like and to really, I mean, of course, not only there's a saturation of lawgivers or lawmakers, and there's also lawyers, So I think I wonder if Sean is a lawyer, So, but the thing is, we have to recognize that this economy of law I likened it. Oh my God, this is a hot take. Hot take coming. It's likened to like a secret economy and secret language that people do not understand, and so they need to pay a premium for lawyers just for them to defend themselves, for example, in crimes, or at least manage their finances. It just feels it's propping up an economy so that lawyers can be paid well, but it's in reality, like, ideally, law should be understood to the point where everyone can defend themselves. But so it's weird. It's like great lawyers are like high priests of a hidden language that only they spent years studying. But in reality, it just creates like this the structure wherein people are still marginalized based on how well they read it. I mean, great that there are some lawyers that do legal aid. They do it for free, pro bono, which is good. But sadly, it's just another form of inequality. So as much as possible,
that is something that emerges from, again, our doctrines on lawmaking. So we are focusing on thoroughly detailed laws. We want to control everything. We want to regulate everything with laws. If you have broad laws, if you have very broad laws, more space for personal interactions, fewer standards, then you would have no lawyers soon. Because people would eventually have, as you said, this ideal, something that I have been teaching in Citygov for a long time, ever since I started. I usually tell my students, the only purpose of lawyers should be magistrates. They should be the ones to interpret the law, but they should not have power of attorney, as far as I'm concerned. So ideally, as you said, I would echo you fully. Ideally, and this is something that we should try to reach, citizens must have their own capacity to defend themselves. Okay? As long as that capacity is not reached, we are not close to a relatively democratic ideal, because you would always have a rule of lawyers, to be more specific. So we don't have a rule of law here in the Philippines. We have a rule of lawyers. And that is
Yeah.
true enough. We have a rule of lawyers in comparison to other
Mhm.
countries wherein legislative bodies are more or less shared between lawyers, social scientists, natural scientists. Oh God, and ruling
Mhm.
over Germany and China right now.
Yeah.
So, and that's another that's a problem, really, you know. And
Mm.
regarding the saturation of lawyers, as I've said, the ideal purpose of law or lawyers are supposed for is for them to be magistrates, to be judges. And
Mhm.
since our listener here have asked question about the congestion in the judicial branch, just a brief background. This brings me back way to my undergrad days. Uh, Again, we conducted brief study, I think under Mambubut for
Oh.
policy design.
Uh-huh.
So we analyzed the where does congestion in the courts come from. It's usually in the appellate court. So next to
The
stuck
what
sila
court?
the Court of Appeals. Court of
Okay.
Appeals. So appellate court. So everything gets stuck there. So regional city courts, they would go to the appeals courts. Then yung mga kaso sa Supreme Court, they would go back to these appeals courts. And there's a lack of judges, to be more specific, because lawyers, it's dangerous to be a judge in the Philippines. It's
Hmm.
dangerous. You
Oh
either
yeah.
lose your life or you either lose your dignity. So you choose what to lose if
Oh.
you're a lawyer here, if you want to be a judge, especially in the
Mm.
appeals court. So mamili ka kung ano mawala sa buhay mo, dignidad.
Oh my
So
God.
I think one of the proposals in that paper, I wrote it
Mm.
with my good friends. One of the proposals is lawyers who choose to be judges, they will be chosen again. They can appeal, they can apply, but they will remain anonymous. They will be
Mhm.
placed in a barracks for their tenure. They will have no
Mhm.
contact outside.
Oof.
They will be placed in the barracks for their own safety. And during sessions, they would wear a hood. So that
Sounds
just
very Greek to me.
yeah, just to produce the anonymity that would protect their lives. But what our concession is, their terms would be brief. Their terms would be brief.
Mm.
So it would be a constant circulation of new judges every now and
Mm.
then. So that's
Sounds like a jury, American jury system, but
mm,
instead it'll be judging, and
yeah.
the ideal is every citizen, if we go back to the Greek ideal and
Mm,
Aristotelian ideal, all citizens should have the capacity to be judges and
mm.
allow themselves to be judged.
Should
That's a
we have
very big ask,
should,
really.
no for that paper we didn't use the jury system. But what do you think that should we have a jury system here in the Philippines?
I mean, that is, if you look at the jury of public opinion, it's yeah. Again, I think the reason why jury duty is considered like again a duty and a responsibility is it's difficult to do, and you should be ideally each
Mm,
jury member should be as objective as possible, but even then the that's why prosecutors, even
mm,
defense attorneys, sometimes they pull at heartstrings just to convince the jury, just
mm,
for sentiment.
yeah.
And that is, I think, the flaw of the jury system. It's
Mm,
sentiment. That's
mm,
why a lot of American cinema and television uh, highlight that tension and drama and
mm,
sentiment because it's so dramatic and emotionally charged. But
mm,
ideally, if this is how we decide on judicial decisions, it will be dangerously unobjective.
mm,
So I don't know. I mean, of course, law there needs to be compassion with the law, but ideally the letter that should be in the letter of the law. There should be leeway on, of course, based on evidence. But if it's based on means that's the same problem we have when it comes to like nagmamakaawa ka sa manong tanod sa kay manong
mm,
pulis. Sige na po, pasensya na po, nagmamadali lang po ako. So if you can do that with a jury, that's
yeah.
a bit. And Filipinos are very sentimental people. Then
Mm,
that's a potential problem,
mm.
a potential, of course, mercy. Ideal institution of mercy, but still, that it's
I don't think Filipinos
dangerous.
are merciful.
Oh, okay.
I think Filipinos can be merciful for their fellow ordinary citizens. So we would have
Mm-hmm.
fewer petty criminals in jail if we would have a
Mm-hmm.
jury system. But we would probably have more elites.
Mm-hmm.
We would probably have more elites in prison right now if we would have a jury system. But regarding
Mm-hmm.
jury system, again, there are also checks and balances for that one.
Mm-hmm.
In the US, I think, if my memory serves me correct, judges can actually switch juries with
Mm.
another court. I think that's how
Yeah.
they got Al Capone in his trial. Al
Yeah.
Capone basically bribed. He knew who would be the parts of the jury for his for his
Mm.
trial. He bribed all of them. I think what
Mhm.
he more or less miscalculated the judge.
No.
What the
Ah.
judge did was during the day of the trial itself, he switched juries with the other court.
Mm.
So blank slate. So he got convicted
Mhm.
with tax evasion. So there are mechanisms to ensure to balance
Right.
out the jury. I think there are only certain cases, relatively low level cases, that are subject to jury decision. But
Mhm.
I think some high level cases are supposed to be done by the judge. I think
Mhm.
there's mid level. I think mid level crimes for jury. Petty crimes, I think, is for the judge, as
Mm.
well as high level crimes. We need to ask Nick for that one.
Oh, yeah. Oh my God.
Jury system.
Naging law podcast ito bigla. Ba't di tayo nag-law? Ah, dami pa natin alam, di ba?
Because no,
Uh,
you know why didn't we take up law? Go, you
mm,
start with that one. Why didn't you take up law?
uh, I mean, I just realized I have well, it sounds like a brag, but I have been told that I have the brain for it because I'm definitely can see. I'm very very particular with the wording with a lot of things. If you notice, even in our conversations, there's implications and sub communication of certain things. So I can definitely think like a lawyer. But the problem is, it sickens me. Like it honestly, I don't want to be part of this. Well, this is almost editorializing, but I can't stomach the fact that they require highly paid, highly educated mediators
Mm.
in order to solve these problems. Ideally, technically, and I think I hope to agree, is technically all of us should be educated in the law to a certain degree, so we'll be able to defend ourselves. The problem is, I think that's a problem with some lawyers. Sometimes they're forced to defend people who they find guilty or people who don't like, and some people
Mm.
that they know nothing about. So this might be, of course, objectivity, but really sometimes even the clients can hide things from their lawyers. So why not cut out the middleman and let the person speak for themselves?
Or
And
the
again,
investigator will just dig out the facts.
exactly. So it's overly complex, and it's in a way a what's the word I'm looking for, a conscientious objection to a
Mm.
system that is unjust,
Mm.
and you do not make it more just by adding more lawyers. And
Yeah.
I might piss off some of the, it's funny, like a lot of the most, like, have any of you reflected on the kind of system it is? It's just you study stacks and stacks of cases. Does it make you more capable of like defending or prosecuting? Maybe but it's based on a specific language. Literally, some people speak Latin or even Spanish. Some of the laws are still in, like, dating back from the Spanish colonial times. So that's, in a way, yeah. I mean, of course there were other reasons that I wasn't ready. There's a anxiety about whether or not I've seen people who were destroyed by law, and some people
Mm.
who successfully went through it but are thoroughly different people, which again, and that doesn't mean I'm judging them for it. But deep down in my core, it is a conscientious objection to that kind of system based on jargon. Ideally, law should not be about jargon. It should be,
Mm.
again, something about simple facts and simple principles.
Mm.
So that's me. What about you?
Yeah, broad. Again, I think the argument of the classical liberals on broad laws would fit perfectly for that. In the Philippines, we
Hmm.
also have space for negotiation. Arregluhan is part of our
No.
arregluhan, pag-areglo,
Aregluhan.
negotiations,
Sounds like another word.
pag-areglo, hindi reglahan gago. Aregluhan,
Anyway,
ew.
yeah.
Aregluhan. It's basically, it sums up our approach to the law and interpersonal relations, to
Hmm.
negotiate and to simply arrive at an agreement. That is what
Hmm.
I think that is our counter response to the rule of law. Negotiations na lang,
Hmm.
arigluhan. So we fix
Hmm.
it. And I think we have legal spaces for that. The barangay justice would be one legal space
Hmm.
for that system of negotiations. So hindi na dadali sa
Hmm.
korte. So barangay justice, barangay captain would preside, would ensure
Hmm.
that the agreement would be fulfilled. That's
Yeah.
it. And I think that
Yeah.
is an ideal schema
Hmm.
if you would adopt broad laws. That would basically
Hmm.
cut off lawyers from again, we are ruled by lawyers. They get their money from this complicated hodgepodge garbage, but of course they would
Woo!
sustain the damn thing. We're bound to sustain the damn thing. Of
I
course,
mean, we're not saying that they're bad
yeah,
people.
we're not saying that
We're
we're
just
bad
saying
people.
that
We're just saying that the system is the
it's,
system is
it's
bad.
unfair. It can be unfair. It's detached from the regular person.
Yeah, it's detached from the regular person.
So is that the same reason? I mean, you didn't answer the question. Why
yeah,
aren't
yeah.
you in law?
Why am I not in law?
Yeah.
Well, I fell in love with political science. On one hand, I would rather make laws than interpret them. But I think one part would be I don't like the system of education in law schools. I don't.
Because?
And that belief was solidified by the experiences of my friends who took law, who actually is also equally disgusted with the system of how to teach law.
Oh my.
So the pedagogy of teaching law in the Philippines is thoroughly outdated on one hand, and on the other hand, it has a tendency to create assholes.
Ooh. Oh well.
Yeah.
Okay.
They break
Let's be
down
careful with that.
they break down people, they break down people, they break down the dignity of people, then they build assholes in their own form. So anyway,
Like,
that's just a general
yeah.
impression to that one. Again, my friends have prevented such from happening. They are not assholes.
That's good.
Good for them. Their dignity is still intact. But
yeah, there are lawyer assholes, definitely.
yeah,
but
so
not
basically
all
they're produced by that then they perpetuate it. If they start teaching in law, they would perpetuate the damn thing, thinking that it's right because it's traditional. No, it's not. Not everything traditional is good.
well, you and I might have a different discussion about that, but at least in the law, I think you and I are in agreement. And as hopefully, I think so. To answer Sean's question, which was very stimulating, the best solution I think would be to make the law more legible to ordinary citizens, and of course that would depend, of course, on the quality of education of regular people, and that leads to another set of reforms, which is educate people to the level that they not only can they make laws, but they can also represent themselves to the laws that they themselves make.
Yeah,
and I think
that's bottom up.
I love, huh?
That's bottom up. That's the bottom up approach. I think from top down, there must be a change in how to write laws and the concern of laws. So I think it's also time to advocate for broad laws and simple language. Abandon this technical lingo.
Yeah, but I also think that in order for us to have a successful system of law, regardless if it's top down or bottom up, is a sense of moral integrity. Because what a law is, essentially, is a promise put down in paper. It is a promise, and if we are not capable of keeping promises, or at least reflecting whether or not we can make this promise, then it's useless. It's really what lawmaking is promise making, and enforcement of the law is enforcement of a promise. If we can think about promise as an interpersonal thing, if you learn to hold promises to account, and then we can have a successful society under laws. But ask ourselves, do we have a society that can keep our promises? Then if not, then we're not ready for laws.
Yeah, then we go back to the old Confucian versus legalist debate. I think the only thing missing from your statement is basically Confucius's argument, which is rule through law is not stable in comparison to rule through virtue, wherein you embody ethics and morality. If you have that, you don't need laws per se. Laws would be secondary. If you have a government with the proper sense of dignity, integrity, laws would be secondary. Because laws are you cannot adequately order a society simply by scaring the shit out of them, which is basically what the law is. Law is basically a system of punishments. So that's Confucius' argument. It is better to order society by more or less having consistent morals, consistent sense of integrity and dignity among citizens. So yeah, we go back to that old debate, and it's more relevant in the Philippines at this point. Because I think our practices of arreglo, pag-arreglo, and our
can't get used to that.
Stop! It's not a.
Okay.
That's basically us asserting interpersonal relations, the primacy of interpersonal relations. So yung pag nag-negotiate ka sa mga police, ano na po, sa pagbigay nyo na hindi ka na uulitin. So that's an
Uh-oh.
interpersonal promise. It's not a legal
Mhm.
one. It's a promise. So, hindi ko na uulitin. So, tapos pag nakita ka uli, patay ka.
Actually, that's another question. Do we need laws to be good people?
No, we
Technically,
don't.
I mean,
As far as country is concerned.
yeah. Some people, actually, that's weird. There's the opposite side of that is in a way we do, but that is of course a Hobbesian thing where if you believe human beings are not. But how cynical do you have to be to distrust people? Well,
Yeah, you have to be cynical enough to be a lawyer.
Oh boy.
That entire
Again,
profession is based on cynicism.
Ooh.
Sorry.
Well,
Okay, that's an overgeneralization. I need to qualify that one. Okay, let's qualify
honestly,
that.
I think we should
qualify.
continue this we should continue this conversation with a real lawyer, but I think this turned into a very deep dive on the legal system and our thoughts on lawyers. And hopefully we've been as fair as we could. But thank you for stimulating that, Sean. And hope we answered your question. If you have more, feel free to send it to us at pipodcastph@gmail.com or even message us through our Facebook page. Anything else, Board, before we go?
Yeah, that's it.
Oh,
I
should
think
we have-
we can do more of it. Or regarding
we will-
education, I think.
Yes. And we will have a special PI NIYO channel soon. It's where you can send it directly under PI NIYO. But until the next episode,
Magandang gabi, mga ka-PI.